Since this video is going to go over how to use, integrate, and cite primary sources in your report and whenever you're going to be using other sources, especially primary sources. So the first thing we need to establish is what is a primary source. In other words, primary research or primary sources is research that you do yourself or data that you gather on your own. It can also be something that you observe firsthand. So for example, if you're a doctor and you're doing clinical trials on a certain medication, that would be data and research that you're gathering yourself. So that would be a primary source. I do want to refer you to the website with the Library of Congress that talks about primary sources. There's lots of explanation on different types of primary sources and what a primary source is. And it kind of talks you through what to think about when you use a primary source. For the purposes of the report, a primary source is, again, going to be something that you observe. So a picture that you take yourself or a screenshot of a social media post that you're observing. So that's going to be what your primary sources are, the things that you observe in your research. The reason we're using primary sources is because it's one of the main course goals for the business writing class. The other thing is that it's a requirement for the report, so you're kind of stuck. You have to use primary sources in your report. The other reason we're using primary sources is because it's the evidence for what you're writing in your report. If you weren't using primary sources, if you weren't talking about what you observed, you wouldn't have anything to write about in your report. So it's actually the raw material. It's what you are reporting in the report. So to use primary sources, you need to make sure that you use them fairly and accurately and you use them effectively. The reason we want to use primary sources or any source fairly and accurately is because of ethical concerns. And I'm having you read this article called How to Lie with Data Visualization. And the problem with when you visualize data or when you use graphs or when you use primary sources is you can manipulate and skew the data to kind of show the reader whatever side you want to show them. So depending on what type of graph you use, how you label that graph, that can skew and manipulate the data for your reader. We actually don't want to do that because that's unethical. So you want to represent your data fairly and accurately. So if you're making your own graphs, you want to read through that article, How to Lie with Data Visualization, and make sure that you are using the proper type of graph, that you're labeling the graph properly, that you're choosing an X and a Y axis that helps you to represent the data in the most ethical way. The other thing that I'm looking for when I'm grading your report is whether or not you're using your primary sources effectively. So there's something called the sandwich method that I want you guys to use, and this is the sandwich method. You're going to introduce your source or your visual, then you're going to put the source or the visual in there, and then you're going to explain the source or the visual. And this is actually the same method that you'll use when we incorporate secondary sources, but I want to bring it up now. So you kind of have the top bun, which is the introduction, the meat of the sandwich, which is the source or the visual itself, and then the explanation kind of is the bottom part of the sandwich. Okay? The reason we do this is we want to give context. So you want the text and the source material to work together. So if you're using a picture, you don't want it to just be thrown in willy-nilly, okay? You want it to enhance and support and work together with the text. So I want to show you an example of this. And this is a student example that I've posted in Blackboard as well. But so here we have a graph that this student has made, and we've got the introduction to the graph itself, and then the explanation of the graph. Now this is a pretty good graph. It's got labels, it's got a title, so I could tell what the graph is about just by looking at it, but you need to explain it as this student has done. You need to tell the reader what you want them to understand about the visual. Don't just throw it in and leave it and expect that your reader will get what you want them to understand. You don't want to put that on the reader. You want to explain it for them. So let's look at another example here. We've got some explanation and introduction to the two pictures, and we've got the two pictures, and then we've got the explanation of why the student has included these two pictures. Then we've got some graphs, And this last sentence here introduces the graphs. We've got the graphs, and then we've got the explanation of the graphs themselves. Okay, so basically, if you're noticing from this example, you've basically got a bunch of little sandwiches: introduction, source material, explanation. That's all the report is a bunch of little sandwiches. So I hope that's helpful to you on how to use your sources. The last thing I want to talk about is copyright. And you can go to the Library of Congress website, click copyright, and you can read more about it. But in a nutshell, copyright law exists because you cannot use things that do not belong to you. Okay, there's this idea of ownership, creatorship, and if you make something, you are the only person who has the right to use that. And this matters because ethically, if you use something that doesn't belong to you, or you pass off an idea or a product or a picture, if you pass that off as your own and it's not your own, it's stealing. It's stealing intellectual or physical property. So you don't want to do that because that's unethical. And that can result in lawsuits. I have a quick story about when this actually happened. I used to own a business, and I had a webmaster who would do my website for me, and he used a stock photo without paying for it, and it was a placeholder on the back end of the website. So it wasn't even something that was available to the public. It was just a placeholder until we got a product photo put on the website. And it actually happened that we got a letter from Getty Images saying you can't use that picture because you didn't pay for it, and we're suing you for several $1,000s. So we actually had to have the webmaster take care of that because we didn't know that he had done that. So it was kind of a mess, and we actually did get sued for using a picture that wasn't ours. So be aware that it does happen, and you don't want to get caught up in that. So you only want to use images or things that belong to you. Now, when you're using sources and you're using something that belongs to someone else, you have to make sure that you cite it correctly. And all you have to do is make sure that you are attributing where you got something. And this is important. So in your actual report, a lot of times students will think, oh, I want to use a picture. So they'll go and they'll type into Google, I want to use a picture of a sneaker, and they'll come across a picture like this, or any of these pictures really, but especially these ones with the watermarks on them. The watermarks exist because you can't use it without paying. And I always kind of laugh when I see students try to use these in school projects on PowerPoints or in the report, because you literally can't use it unless you pay for it. That's why they have that watermark on there. So that's a no-no. The other thing is you can't just use any picture you want. This picture belongs to someone else. See how it's watermarked? This one doesn't have a watermark, but if you didn't make it, if you didn't take this picture, it's not yours. So you can't use images that don't belong to you. One way around that is you can go and type in free stock photos, and this is pexels.com, and it has free stock photos. So if I wanted a picture of a Nike sneaker for my report, I can use this picture because it says it's free for personal and commercial use, and no attribution is required. So this is a picture that someone has taken that they've put out into the public domain that's free for use. So when you have a picture that is free for use, you're good to go. But unless it's your picture, you need to give credit to the owner. Now there's something called fair use, and fair use applies to things, especially in education or when you're using something for personal use. So if I were performing a song that someone else had written, like a song from the radio, I could sing that song for my family and friends in my home. But if I decided to have a concert and I was charging money for that concert, then I would need to get commercial approval to sing that song. If I wanted to sing that song for my class or for a class project, that would be fine because it's for educational purposes and I weren't getting compensated or anything for that. So technically for this class and for school projects, if you're using images or things like that, sources, outside sources, technically under fair use, you're allowed to use them. However, do you have to cite sources and visuals for this project? Yes. Even though you're probably covered under fair use in most cases, I want you to practice citing your sources because it's a course learning outcome. So you need to cite your visuals and make sure that you're just attributing where you got them. I'm going to show you how to do that. So if Nike posts a picture on Instagram and you take a screenshot, like this student has done, basically all you need to do is give credit to where you got it. So this student was looking at Maui Jim's Facebook page. Okay, so these images come from Maui Jim's Facebook page. So I'm not assuming that he took this picture because he introduces it and says where he got the image. Okay, so the student says that this is an image that came from the Instagram, Maui Jim's Instagram. And that's really all you have to do for this project is make it clear where you got your images. Okay, even though this is your screenshot that you took and your primary source, you didn't take this picture, so you need to make sure that you're saying where you got things. Okay, and that's really all that you have to do for this project. And that's really all that you have to do most of the time in business writing, because in the business world, you don't usually have a works cited or a reference page. Basically, you just have to give context to the reader so that the reader knows what's yours and what's borrowed content. All you have to do is give credit to the original creator. Sometimes in business documents you'll use an appendix, but that is not necessary for the report. All I'm looking for is that you're using sources in a way that's ethical, you're fairly representing them, and then you're saying where you got your sources. You're giving credit where credit is due. And really, most of the time, that's all that you need to do. Later in the semester, we'll practice how to do formal citation. But for the report, all you have to do is informally give credit when you've borrowed source material. So I hope that's helpful. And if you have any questions, please let me know.